Welcome to the Smart Business Revolution.
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 You want a revolution?
You say you want a revolution?
Revolution. The revolution.
It's going on right now.
Welcome to The Revolution, the Smart Business Revolution podcast, where we ask today's most successful entrepreneurs to share the tools and strategies they use to build relationships and connections to grow their revenue. Now, your host for The Revolution, John Corcoran.
All right, welcome everyone. John Corcoran here. You know me, I'm the host of this show, and every week I get to talk to such great, interesting CEOs, founders, entrepreneurs, all kinds of companies ranging from, check out my interview a couple of weeks ago with the co-founder and CEO, original CEO of Netflix, leaders from YPO, EO, Activation, Blizzard, Lending Tree, you name it. I'm also the co-founder of Rise 25, where we help connect B2B business owners to their ideal prospects. And I'm so excited today because I have an old friend here on the podcast who's coming back. It's been a while since we've had a chat on the podcast. His name is Dr. Dave Stachowiak, and he is an old friend. He's a coach and a podcaster. He's the host of the Coaching for Leaders podcast and founder of the Coaching for Leaders Academy. And he, was also a leader in the Dale Carnegie Organization, the worldwide leader in professional training and development for many years. And I wanted to have him come back on just to reconnect because it's been a while, Dave, and also because we're recording this in April of 2021. We've been through a year of some crazy upheaval through the pandemic. And I wanted to ask him, because he really has his finger on the pulse of how leaders have been adapting through this time period. I want to ask him what that experience has been like. And so we're gonna hop into that in a moment. But first, before we get to that, this episode, of course, is brought to you by Rise 25, where we help B2B business owners to get clients, referrals, and strategic partnerships with done-for-you podcasts and content marketing. And if you're listening to this and you're curious about starting a podcast, Dave and I will tell you it's one of the best things that I think we've ever done personally. And Dave, I'll just bring you into it. Tell me a little bit about, you've been doing it for about the same period of time as we both got started around the same time, maybe about 10, 11 years ago now. And what kind of an impact has it had for you?
Oh, it changed everything for me. It started as a hobby it was a couple hours a week when I started. If you had told me 10 years ago where I'd be today because of that choice, I don't think I would have believed you with what's emerged from it. So it's really been, for me, the opportunity to tap into my strengths and to utilize them well in a medium that really speaks to me, one I enjoyed very much as a listener, and now get the privilege to get to be on the other side of the mic too. It's been a blast. Right.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Well, so let's talk a little bit about how things have changed over the last year. So first of all, take me back to a year ago, a little bit over a year ago now, March of 2020. And, everything's kind of going to pieces as this pandemic's unfolding. What are you observing in terms of your own business and all these different leaders that work in different companies that you work with? What was it like? Tell me what it was like at that point.
Yeah, well, I'll answer our own business question first. The thing that I found personally hardest from a professional level, set aside all the personal stuff for a moment, but on a professional level, I had been working virtually and mostly online for the better part of 8-9 years when this happened a year ago. And so I had been through all of the Zoom fatigue and working online and mostly being on video conference and working from home. And I had been down that journey gradually over the course of a couple of years until really moving into that full time for, 6-7 years since. And so the part that I struggled with on a personal level professionally was needing to put myself back into a place of really trying to find empathy with people who were making that transition for the first time. Because I had made that transition, but it had been so long and I was so used to working virtually that all of a sudden, all of our clients and organizations that we serve were making this transition. And unlike the privilege I had, which is to make that transition gradually over a few years, they were forced to do it. That I found hard just because I needed to really get myself back. You get used to doing something one way, and that was challenging for sure. From the perspective of our clients, I mean, there's so many things that were challenging during this time. I think the best way I can answer this question, though, is like what I still see now. Because of course there was how do we get on Zoom, and how do we get people the technology they need at home, and how do we set up home working spaces and all that. And for better or worse, a lot of that is kind of figured out at this point. Like everyone's been doing this long enough that those sort of tactical technology things have been answered. The bigger challenge, I think, now is the boundaries piece. And this goes back to something that's been in the research for probably 10, 20 years, John, is, there've been all these studies over the years on like, what is it like how productive are people working virtually ever since we've had the opportunity to work remotely?
Yeah, there's been some disagreement about that. I remember, I forget what her name was, the leader of Yahoo. She came in and very controversial. She said everyone who was working remotely had to come back into the office. She
did, yeah. Marissa Mayer, and that was a very controversial decision at the time. And most of the academic literature, though, that over the years has painted a picture that people are as productive in working virtually, and in many cases more so. And yet we have had this cultural feeling in many organizations that if you work virtually, somehow you are a second-class citizen, or you're not working as hard, or God forbid, like, what if you did something else other than work, while you were supposed to be on the clock, or whatever version of that in whatever organization.
As if people who work in an office never do that sort of thing.
Right? Exactly. And the research has been really consistent on this for years, that when you look at it and you actually do the studies on people tend to work more from home because two big reasons. One is they don't have the commute time, and most of us don't, it turns out, like take that time and spend more time with family or spend more time on hobbies. We work more, which is what we replace it with. And then secondly is people, especially early on when this was an option, felt like they needed to overcorrect for the time that they weren't there in the office. And so they were the kind of people who were doing this were, by and large, there's always exceptions, but by and large, were people who were like, hey, I'm going to really demonstrate that I'm getting things done and I'm working hard. And now we've sort of all experienced this for real, right? Yeah. It's not just a subset in a research study somewhere anymore.
Yeah.
We've all seen, I haven't heard anyone say, well, working from home for the last year, I'm working less and I have better work-life balance.
Right. No.
What is happening now all the time is we're hearing people say, I'm working more hours, I'm burned out, I'm working on weekends. And what is really becoming a reality, I think, for a lot of us, and I'm struggling with this too, John, is boundaries. The boundaries that we were used to that would separate our work lives and our personal lives, of commutes, of picking up kids from school, of outside activities, of places we went on the weekend. For us, it was like Sunday morning, we go to church. We haven't done that in a year. Mm-hmm. And so all of a sudden, work's still there, and it creeps into a lot of those times. And those traditional boundaries a lot of us had have disappeared. And this, for me, really culminated a week or two ago. I was facilitating one of our academy sessions, and someone mentioned that they had a couple of employees out on a mental health leave. And then someone else mentioned the same thing. And I sort of got this sense like, oh, this is a bigger thing than I thought. And I just asked, how many people here in the virtual room, there were 8 of us, how many people here who have employees who are out on mental health leave right now? And not only did everyone raise their hand, but everyone had multiple people who were out on whatever their organization's version of mental health leave, stress leave, whatever. And I thought, wow, here we are more than a year into this. And we think we're done. And we're so far from being done. We're so far from being done. We are done with some of the logistical things, but now we're all kind of struggling with this new virtual world, and we're all trying to get better at it. And that's hard. And that's the biggest thing I see right now.
Interesting. And for you, you're seeing it, I imagine, amongst your leaders who are managers who are managing people. So they're stressed, they're dealing with these things, but they're also having to figure out how to navigate it for the people that they are overseeing as well.
Yeah. And this is super like an interesting space to me of like, how do we get better at navigating this? And I'm just now starting to see some of the books coming out. In fact, we're going to do a couple episodes on it, hopefully later this year, on the people who've done a lot of research on burnout and stress management. And so I don't have a lot of good answers yet, because I think this is new territory. I mean, burnout isn't new, but in this context of working virtually, this is new territory for a lot of us. But I know one of the things that I'm starting to think more about just for myself, and I'm inviting our clients to think about it more, is how do you start to put in some boundaries? How do you not only do that for yourself, but also encourage that in your organization of, let's agree that email goes off at 6 p.m. or that we're not going to do the texting in the evenings, or whatever version of that feels right. I mean, every organization's different. Every organization has a different culture. But I think every leader, every team has the opportunity to think about boundaries in a new way. And to do that, to really actually help people to find some of that structure that we've really been missing, especially the first few months of the pandemic. We were kind of all like in this chaos, react mode. And we've lost some of those traditional boundaries. And that's something I've been thinking about a lot.
And how do you create those boundaries if you are reporting up to someone higher on the food chain who isn't the one creating those boundaries, or maybe doesn't respect them or struggles with them themselves?
Yeah, that's always a hard thing, John, managing up and getting someone to see that perspective. I always try to approach that from the business case. Mm-hmm. And it sounds silly, but so many executive leaders do tend to be folks that think about, they tend to be logical thinkers. They think about numbers. They think about data. They do, I think, by and large, want to do really well by people. And it helps them to sometimes quantify, how can we do better? That's an easier entry point sometimes than having a conversation like, I think people are really stressed out right now. And I think that's a hard thing for a lot of leaders to and especially at the executive level, to start like, okay, I get that. I sort of know that, but I don't know what to do with that.
Well, in some ways they can relate in new ways. It's not like, a 60-year-old CEO whose 25-year-old employee is pregnant and is out on pregnancy leave, and they don't know how to relate to it. In this case, there's so many things that are relatable, or they're universal at no matter what stage, no matter what gender, no matter what our age is, no matter what stage of life we're in.
Yes, I do think that is true.
Although I will say, oftentimes resources make a big difference too, and
that they do. Yes,
for sure. And there's definitely a gender disparity, which is a huge issue,
and childcare and all the things that we're all dealing with. It absolutely does. But to your point, we're all in this together in some way that we aren't often when those things come up. We all have a common narrative around this, which is both in some ways makes some things easier, but also in some ways makes some things harder. There's the tendency, I think, sometimes like, we're all working a lot of hours.
Yeah.
We all are struggling with this right now. Yeah, I'm working from home too. And to miss the opportunity for a bit of empathy on what we could do different. So back to the, like, how would I approach this with a manager? I'd start with the business case. I might feel if I have someone who's, we are, for whatever reason, we are working crazy hours. People are texting at all hours. People are on email at all hours because the boundaries aren't there. I'm probably not going to start that conversation with an executive leader who doesn't see, like, is not kind of seeing the people side of that. I'm probably not going to start with the people side of that. I'm not going to say, people are stressed, they're frustrated, all that. I'm probably going to start that conversation with something more like, one of the things I'm noticing over the last couple of weeks is that we're not getting the same numbers that we were on, whatever the metric is. And here's the number I'm noticing that's shifting. And here's something that I think that might be a cause for that is we're spending a little bit too much time on communication. We're spending too much time processing. Here's a suggestion I have. Let's make this change and make this piece of movement on this, whatever that is. I think for the person who's not seeing it, that's a more likely entry point to say, okay, yeah, I'm going to make a business decision that, you and I know is also going to make people's lives better and actually reduce stress. Right. At the end of the day, it's sort of like, it's less important what drives the decision and more important that the decision gets made. So if I can influence through the business case, I want to go down that route. And I often invite people, you may feel really strongly about something. You might be angry and frustrated and at wit's end, and bringing that emotion into a lot of managing up conversations, most of the time is probably not going to serve you well. Mm-hmm. So it's not that you're saying, hey, I don't have that emotion. It's that you put it in a box for a half hour and go have the business conversation first. And then when you come out of that conversation, you open up the box and take all that back on, right? But if you can start there, I think that that's a helpful entry point, that it makes it more likely for that person to be able to see it.
What else are you observing amongst your leaders that you've been working with over the last year that they've been struggling with?
It's interesting how many things have not changed also. One of the things that struck me as we were 3-4 months into this is how COVID didn't come up in a lot of conversations. So it was contextually always there, of course. There was always a mention about, like what's going on with the virus locally. But it's also really interesting to me how much hasn't changed. The things that came up in our academy groups and with our listeners, I don't often get questions about how do we handle this situation, specifically COVID. So COVID may be a part of it, but the question is really about delegation. Or it's really about how do I have career conversations with someone? Or it's about how do I set good expectations? They may be disguised as a COVID question occasionally, but really it comes down to still the central things that I think most leaders are always learning and trying to get better at is core management, core leadership skills.
Interesting. What is, your business has evolved quite an amount over the years. The Academy. Well, first, tell us what the Academy is.
The Academy is a year-long experience with participant leaders who work personally with me over a year to get movement and traction in their leadership development. It is very much not like a traditional curriculum. We are because so many of our clients are well-educated, have gone through lots of leadership training in the past, we don't really focus much time there at all. We spend our time on problem solving and movement and behavior change. That's really the focus of the work, is to get traction with the things that people already know most of the time, but just haven't done as consistently as they want.
And what have you learned? Now, you've been through multiple versions. You've run it for a number of years now. Yeah. What have you learned in that time? How's the program evolved?
Yeah, the thing I've learned and keeps being repeated is just how much things don't change as far as some of the core leadership skills that I mentioned a moment ago. But the other thing that I've learned is to actually have behavior change be small. And I learned this back, you mentioned Dale Carnegie in the introduction, John. I learned this back at Dale Carnegie. One of the things that I discovered as a Dale Carnegie instructor is we would do sessions with folks, and oftentimes they would be separated by a week. And the invitation, the action was, take what you learned in this session, go out. And Carnegie was brilliant. He said, go out and apply it. One person, try it one time between now and next week, and then come back and tell the class what you did.
Mm.
It was very action oriented, very behavior oriented. And the people who would go out and try the skill that they learned with a bunch of people or everybody would come back and they kind of felt like sometimes they'd have a good story to tell. Sometimes they'd make some movement, but they often didn't have like a big breakthrough. The people who would literally do what we asked as Carnegie instructors and would go find one person and try it one time would come back and they tell these amazing stories. And then the weird thing is they'd end up start doing it other places too. It's like they hadn't intended to do that, but it just started naturally happening. And I finally, it happened so many times. I was like, okay, this isn't just a fluke. There's something behind this. And it turns out and you look at the research and especially some of the amazing research that's coming out on habits now from James Clear and BJ Fogg. And if you just get really specific and get focused on one thing, how much traction you can make, how important consistency is. So one of the biggest things that I've changed my mind in the academy is the thing I am coaching people on the most is to do less. Because they come into our groups and they'll say, hey, I really want to work on my coaching skills and I want to work on being a better storyteller and I want to delegate more effectively. And they come with 2 or 3 things they're going to work on and they've got it all mapped out of like what they're going to do over the next couple of weeks. And that's where I kind of launch myself in usually. And I try to get really directive, like pick one and pick one you can do in 5 minutes a day, no more. Because if you try to do something that's going to take you 15 or 20 or 30 minutes a day, you'll do it on day 1 and day 2 and day 3. And then the motivation level starts to drop. Like like BJ Fogg says, we overestimate our future motivation. And so day 17, day 43, you're not still doing it. So that's why a big part of our academy process is asking everyone to make 90-day commitments, but it comes down to 5 minutes a day. Take a 5-minute daily action. On the days you feel like doing more, great. But on the days you don't, 5 minutes to create momentum and create consistency. And the people who really latch onto that, it's amazing to see what they can shift in 90 days.
Yeah. Well, BJ Fogg, his whole thing is tiny habits, I think, right?
Yeah,
That's his thing, right?
Yeah. And that I've totally changed my mind on as someone who's kind of like achievement is on my strengths finder as pretty high, and or achiever, I think they call it. And so are a lot of folks who are in our listening community. And so we've sort of gotten to where we are by taking on a lot, by multitasking, by doing a lot of things well. And that works for a lot of things. But when it comes to behavior change, it turns out that doesn't work so well. And so the getting really specific and clear on one thing and getting traction and momentum turns out that works way better than trying to do 13 things at once as far as professional development.
Yeah, I think probably the most, it's interesting as our organization, as our company, Rise 25 has evolved and changed and we've grown a lot, added a lot more team members. I've had to grow as a leader. You know, it's amazing. You really, you have to change and evolve. And one of the most impactful thing I've done the whole year, and it didn't come because I thought I needed to do it. It came because other leaders told me that you need to do this, was just sitting down and having one-on-one conversations with different team members, focused on them and focused on how we can make their lives easier and make this a great place to work. And, you know, it had such a great impact on us, just taking the time to do that. It really helped me to change by putting the focus on others. Is that the sort of thing? Is that the sort of thing that you recommend doing?
Yeah. I mean, putting our focus on others, what a great place to be intentional about as a leader. The term that's been tossed around over the years, servant leadership, right?
Yeah.
So if we can really approach it from a service of others. And I love what Pat Lencioni says about that. He says, well, what other kind of leadership is that? Is there? Like, that's the way it should be, right? And I love that because ultimately, I mean, yes, leadership starts with us. Like, we need to lead ourselves well first. But the heart of leadership comes from, am I here to serve me because I want a good title or a fancy office or whatever? Or am I here because I really want to do right by others? And the people who've made the choice to mostly, I say mostly because none of us entirely are in one place or the other, right? But if we can mostly be in the place where we're driven by the desire to serve others and get to a place of being useful and helpful to people, then the other things kind of take care of themselves. It's like you and I talked about right before. I hope you don't mind me mentioning this before this conversation, John, as I asked, who's listening to this episode? What's your audience care about? Because we could have a lot of great conversations that you and I would be like, have a ton of fun with, but wouldn't necessarily be contextually relevant to our audience. Right, and right. So from like the question I'm always trying to challenge myself with is, what can I do to serve the person that's in front of me right now? And if I can serve them well, then that's going to ultimately serve me well. I don't need to worry about that. That's a lagging indicator. The leading indicator is, how do I go out and serve and be as helpful to this person today as much as I can?
I love that. I'm always struggling with what our leading indicators are. So that is one that's actually not on there. So I need to make sure that that I don't know how you quantify that in a number, but I love that you said that just focusing on the person right in front of you. That's great. We're running a little short on time. So I want to ask 3 questions here at the end. So first is 2 of my big passions that I love doing are creating content and also relationship building and helping others to build better relationships, AKA networking. It's what we're doing here. It's what I get to do for a living. It's what you get to do for a living.
Yeah.
What tips do you have for anyone who's listening to this about how to combine those 2 things and things that you've learned through doing your podcast over these years, creating a lot of content, building a lot of great relationships? What advice do you have for others who might be listening to this?
It's interesting you say the word combine. And I think this will answer your question. I think a lot about intersections. I, for a while, was a manager and in a business role, and I was a decent employee. I was a decent manager. I wasn't world class. I never won the awards really. I won some sales awards at Carnegie, but I never, no one was going to hold me up as like the example of amazing management or write books about like anything I did, for sure. And then at one point in my career, John, I had not 100% decided, but I was pretty sure I was going down the direction of academia and teaching. And I got my doctorate and was doing a lot of part-time teaching for years. And I was good at that, but I wasn't great at it. And I was a great teacher, but I would have been a good professor. What I'm doing now is the intersection between the 2. So the people who are coming on the podcast often are people who are at the forefront of research. I mean, the professors, the researchers, the leaders out there who are just absolutely like stellar on something that they have something to teach. And then there's the people listening by and large who are amazing managers. Most of our audience, like I'm in awe every time I talk to people, like how amazing they are and how much they've integrated from what they've learned on our show and others and the books they've read. And I think like, gosh, I wasn't anywhere close to that when I was a manager. And I was like decent at both those things when I tried to dabble. Me being the person at the intersection that helps those 2 groups talk to each other, it turns out I'm really darn good at that. Because I know enough of the academic language and kind of the way the researchers approach things. And I know enough about what it's like to be in that world. And the intersection between the 2 is what's been huge for me and actually being able to serve both of those parties well.
Yeah, and so, I think, by the way, Scott Adams, the Dilbert creator, talks about that notion of, you can be good at this and good at that, but if you combine the 2, you can be the greatest at something that no one else is great at.
Oh, that's great. I didn't know that. So I'll go track it down. I mean, and some really amazing things have happened with this. I've had two people on the show who, were in the president's cabinet in the last couple of years. I mean, it's really been remarkable how well that's worked. And for me, it's been all about intersections. And I guess the thing I'd say to everyone listening is we do, when we make career transitions, when we make business transitions, I think often our tendency is to kind of wipe the slate clean, start anew, start fresh. And we forget all those years of experience we've had doing something that maybe we didn't do great or we weren't stellar at. But that experience, that perspective, oftentimes combined with something else, or maybe just shifted slightly, can be huge on what you do next. And leveraging that time and those relationships and those talents, I think, is huge.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Second to last question. I'm a big fan of gratitude. So if you look around at your peers, your contemporaries, however you define that, others in your industry, other trainers, other leaders, other podcasters, maybe, who do you respect? Who do you admire?
I really respect people who are just out there doing the work, who love what they do, who are passionate about it, and aren't, yes, they're running successful businesses, but that's not really what it's about. It's about serving people well. A couple of examples of that. My friend Kwame Christian, a couple of years ago, or several years ago now, started the Negotiate Anything podcast. He runs the American Negotiation Institute. And he brought speaking of someone who's leveraged a talent he had, came as a lawyer, a legal background, just like you, John, and took that talent and that success that he had and really turned it into something really unique of teaching people negotiation skills. And he is now working for some of the biggest brands out there. He's killing it in his business. It's amazing to see him, the transition, the growth they've had in the last few years, and also the heart he has for serving people. And that's been huge. And I love that he's doing that work. Another example of that is my friend Chris DeFurio. He spent his entire career working in coffee. Was a barista for years. Has been in management in coffee shops. Won the I'm going to mess it up, the World Latte Art, and there's like it's super cool, like all the ecosystem that's around the coffee world, and took the passion of all those things of working in coffee shops and excitement and put it into a podcast called Keys to the Shop, and now is working with coffee shop owners all over the place and helping them to get better. And, so cool. He's killing it. It's really amazing to see. And then one other person I'd mention that I don't know well, she's been on the show, is Minda Harts. Minda is the author of a book called The Memo. And she is out there confidently and unapologetically making the case for Black women in the workplace. Mm-hmm. It is a demographic that so many of us have ignored or not paid attention to. And I'll put myself in that category too, John, over the years. It's embarrassing to me how few people of color we had on the show in the early years. And she is out there telling a very personal story about her experience, but also is bringing along a ton of Black women and also allies who care a lot about what us all doing better on race and diversity and inclusion, not only here in the States, but around the world. Her work's really, it really inspires me that she's out there so courageously doing the work. So those are three people that come to mind.
Those are great. Thank you. All right, last question. Let's pretend we're at an awards banquet, much like the Oscars or the Emmys, and you, Dr. Stachowiak, are getting an award for lifetime achievement for everything you've done up until this point. And so what we all want to know is, who do you thank? In addition to family and friends, who are the colleagues, who are the friends, who are the mentors, who are the peers, business partners, professors, who are the people that you would acknowledge in your remarks?
All of those people, but the people specifically, I think I would mention, perhaps not all by name, would be every boss I ever had. I have been so fortunate. I've had some amazing bosses throughout my career. I've also had, like everyone, some not so great bosses.
I would hope so. I was like, okay, come on, please, right? I'm not the only one, right?
No. And then I've had a lot in between, right? but I've learned something from everyone. And there are still things I use today that someone did that was not good like 15 years ago. And I think, I don't want to do that. I don't want to be that person. And I've been really struck by how many of our listeners have told me over the years that, and they have an even better way of looking at it than I do, like having a bad boss, it's a frustration, but in some ways can be a blessing looking back because of all the things you learn not to do and of all the mistakes you see them make. And I think that when any of us find ourselves in that position where we're working with the client we don't want to work with or the boss that we didn't want to have, that's an opportunity for us to like really clarify for the next client relationship, the next organization we go work for. What am I going to watch for that helps me to find what's going to work for me, the person I want to work for, the person I want to serve? And that's something that has served me well over the years.
For sure. I couldn't agree more. Well, Dave, this has been great. We got to do this a lot more frequently. I always enjoy talking to you. Where can people go to connect with you, check out the podcast, learn more about the Academy, all that kind of stuff?
Yeah. Thanks, John. It's been a pleasure. Best place to go is just Coaching for Leaders on whatever podcast app. And it's at coachingforleaders.com. Everything else.
Excellent. All right, Dave. Thank you so much.
Thanks, John.
Thank you for listening to the Smart Business Revolution podcast with John Corcoran. Find out more at smartbusinessrevolution.com. And while you're there, sign up for our email list and join the revolution.
Revolution.
And be listening for the next episode of the Smart Business Revolution podcast.